One distracting thing today is the continuation of winter. Thank you for those of you who had to travel outside to come to our program today, but we're happy to see all of you here today. This Medical Center Hour is also the annual Kenneth R. Crispell Memorial Lecture in the History of the Health Sciences. This lecture is named for one of UVA's past leaders, a celebrated endocrinologist, medical school dean, and vice president here in the 1970s. So, how should we imagine the history of distraction? Is it true that the internet has made us distracted in a way that we never have been before? And if it has, is that necessarily bad? And what is distraction, anyway? In this Medical Center Hour, East Asian cultural historian Shigehisa Kuriyama suggests that comparative reflection on images of skulls and skeletons can offer us illuminating insight into these questions and into the entwining of distraction with art, anatomy, curiosity, and early modern global trade. If you're not intrigued now, once he starts talking, I think you will be. We just spent a delightful hour and a half or so with him with the history of medicine class. He does quite magical things with pictures. And I think the enlargement of our perspectives, the enrichment of our perspectives, is something that we will all appreciate in this hour. So please welcome Hisa Kuriyama.
Thank you. So, self-control. Self-control is something that I think is always a good thing. We all value it. But self-control without the hyphen is actually a software program which is supposed to help you avoid distracting websites. The idea is, of course, you have all these things. The internet has all these distractions that sort of are tempt and attract your attention, and before you know it, your control is all gone, destroyed by weapons of mass distraction. In 2008, Nicholas Carr published this article which made a bit of a splash about how suggesting that the internet is making us less intelligent by making us so distracted. The question that one question that arises is really whether we've entered a new age, that all the proliferation of mobile devices, whether the internet and all these things have altered our minds in some fundamental way, and is this a really a modern phenomenon? But to answer this question, I think we have to think about what is distraction. The common idea, I think, of distraction goes something like this, that distraction is the opposite of attention. Right? Either distracted or paying attention. But think about this. This is an early article, but I'm sure it's true now, especially here. James Surowiecki wrote an article about distraction in March Madness. And he was talking about how all these employees, I'm sure you've seen all the ads on the March Madness commercials, similar kind of things where they're spending their time watching the show or watching the games rather than working. So this model, I think, is very interesting because it suggests that if you're working on your Excel sheets, spreadsheets, you're paying attention. If you're watching March Madness, you're distracted. So that when you're paying attention to work and duties, this is called attention. But when you're paying attention to amusements, this is called distraction. So it isn't really that attention and distraction are necessarily two different things. It's a question about the objects of attention. Many academics, the famous absent-minded professors, this idea of the absent-minded professor who's not paying attention, of course, is premised on the idea that he's not paying attention to what really matters. He's paying attention to these research things that most people can't understand, so he's distracted. There's also another program called Freedom, which is a world famous app that locks you away from the internet so you can be productive. So this idea of attentiveness, or as the opposite of distraction, is closely associated with this notion of productivity. The internet is distracting you from your work. Freedom may be the best $10 you ever spent. This, by the way, is I don't use it. I don't necessarily recommend it. It's a pretty frightening program. What it does is it shuts off your access to the internet for whatever time you specify. So you say 5 hours, I'm going to go cold turkey with the internet. And for 5 hours, it won't let you get on the internet, even if you turn off your computer and turn it back on. It's quite ruthless, but effective. This idea of distraction has, in fact, though, a long history, including the medieval period, where people talk about the vain amusements of distraction. And the word vain is important, which of course comes from the Latin vanus, empty, and it's related to notions of vanity and vacancy. The notion of distraction is remains part of the Catholic catechism, so that being distracted is an important impediment to prayer. And vanity means attention to things that don't matter. One of the things that used to be considered a major distraction was novel reading. It's an article from the Sydney Herald from 1971 talking about the novel reading disease. And it's basically people like this who are so absorbed in the novel that the world can, that's the book becomes, the story becomes the focus of all of their attention. And volcanoes may be going on in the background, there could be tropical storms, but they're just totally absorbed in the world of the book. So one view is basically that distraction is attention to amusements, and attention is really attention to work and duties. And I think this is actually the paradigm that's most common today. When we're talking about being distracted, watching the March Madness and being distracted, but doing your studies is considered attention. But a broader way to think about this is this, that attention is attending to what you view as really valuable and substantial. Right? So vain, the association of vanity with distraction, is this idea that there are things that are empty, which are really not substantial, and things that are valuable. And depending on what you're paying attention to, you're either distracted or attentive. So it's not a question of different psychological state, it's a question of the objects of attention. Another way to think about this is, if this is your life, and you have a certain amount of time to live, and you're expending that time in, say, you could expend them in useful activities, or you could spend them on useful activities. And that time is going to go by anyway. And it's all a question of how you're going to spend that time. Eventually you're going to run out of time. This is actually not probably your life, this is probably my life. With a large proportion of useless activities. I'm a great believer actually in useless activities. But the question really is, what is useful and what is useless? Right? This is the question raised by the problem of distraction. So, the first point I want to make is that the distinction between distraction and attention really turns on the judgment of what truly matters. And this is the fundamental question that we ultimately have to consider. What truly matters? What matters most to you? You have a certain amount of time to live. how are you going to spend it? So the literature about distraction and attention tends to focus on neuropsychology, but what I want to emphasize that it's really about values of, beliefs about existence and value. Right? What do you really treasure? So interestingly, this ad for SelfControl, this is actually from the website, features a skull, right? Which is sort of an odd thing to feature in your website. Like if I were selling my product, I didn't know that I'd feature a skull. But it's there because it's sort of illustrating the tension between limited time and limitless curiosity and desires. This is what the internet offers you, all this potential world of exploration. But that potential infinity of worlds to explore highlights all the more the finite time that you have. We all have a finite time. This is universal to all of us. The question is how you spend that limited resource. That state of confronting the infinity of desires and the limited sort of time we have to live, I suggest is really fundamental already in the early modern period. So one of the early manifestations of science are the cabinets of curiosity, where collections of objects from all over the world made available by the voyages of exploration would gather. And it was a mind-blowing experience that you suddenly see all these things that you didn't even, whose existence you didn't even know. Every year you'd wonder, what other fascinating, mind-blowing discovery would be brought and made available to you. And these cabinets of curiosity would gather them together. But if you look at these cabinets of curiosity, you notice some interesting things. So what do we see in such cabinets? We see, among other things, we see precious jewels, valuable things. These pearls will probably come from Southeast Asia. These gems from India. But you also see a clock, a watch. And of course, you also see a skull. And you see as well an urn. Right? Here's another cabinet of curiosity. And you can see all these things that I've highlighted here are clocks. So there's a proliferation of clocks among all these proliferation of sort of oddities gathered from around the world, emphasizing the keen sense of time. Once you start gathering things and exploring all the things treasures there are to explore in the world, you become much more conscious of how limited your time is. If we look at this, this is actually a sand clock here. You can see this little detail. There's a skull on top of the sand clock. Now, it's in this period that we have to situate the birth of modern anatomy. I think a lot of you will be familiar with the following economy, where the traditional narrative is you have these professors who would discourse on anatomy without actually getting their hands dirty, and mainly reciting lessons from the ancients, especially Galen. And looking straight ahead, not actually observing the body, and the contrast between this vision and the famous frontispiece to Dissection Fabrica, where you have a public dissection and people are sort of gathered around the dissected body. And this is supposedly, one of the 1543 Copernicus's work on the revolution of the spheres, and Dissection Fabrica, sort of easy benchmarks for one way of thinking about the birth of modern science, and particularly in the case of anatomy, the birth of the empirical spirit, the spirit of observation. But if we look really carefully at this picture, what do we see? Well, we do see people who are hunched over, focused on the dissected wound, which makes sense. This is what we would expect in work promoting dissection. But in the upper right corner, we see people sort of focused not on the body, but on this young man's sleeve, which looks vaguely like dissected sinews. In the lower corner, we have some people who are being distracted by a man with a dog. In the lower left, we find two youths whose attention is focused on a monkey. Some people hunched over a book. People talking. And then this naked man who's appeared out of the shadows. So the key point is in the frontispiece, that is the face of this book, which is supposedly the sort of the announcement of the new age of empirically based science. You have a scene which is essentially a scene of distraction. People are not paying attention to the dissected body. They're paying attention to all sorts of different things. And if we look at the dissector himself, we notice something very strange, which is that the dissector himself is not looking at the dissected corpse, he's looking at us, as if he's being distracted by the reader. And he's pointing with his finger and saying, this is what you must observe. But again, he's not pointing to the dissected corpse. He's pointing to the skeleton, which is arising out of the dissected wound. He says, this is what you really have to observe. And if we look at the picture as a whole again, we see that this skeleton is at the very center of this illustration. But if you go back, I know that you have a copy of the original here. If you go back and study this illustration, you'll see that basically nobody in this scene of people looking at all sorts of things is looking at the skeleton. That is the one thing that the dissector says you must look. That is, everybody is distracted. So the question, the key to understanding this illustration is really that what to make of this scene. So this is my illustration of the basic nature of anatomical seeing. Does anybody see anything of this? What do you see here? You probably all know this. The popular name for this is magic eye. It's also known as stereograms. Does anybody know how to look at this? Anybody see anything of this? Sort of cross your eyes, yeah. But I want to suggest this is actually, if you want to understand what classical anatomy was all about, this is the picture to bear in mind. Does anybody know how to find it? There is an image in here. It's actually a very striking three-dimensional image, if you can see it. And the key to these images is we all tend to look at something as an object. So if you look at the screen as a screen, and you focus on it, then you just see noise. Right? But if you try to look through this and look at the screen as a window and look beyond it, then you'll be able to see this three-dimensional shape. There are many, similar, magic eye illustrations on the internet. You can try it on yourself. But basically, the reason I think this is very appropriate for thinking about anatomy is this. A popular view of anatomy says you're looking at the dissected body, the body as an object. This is what you're studying. But what anatomists from Aristotle already sort of emphasizes how that isn't actually what anatomy is all about, because what you're looking at is just flesh. And that flesh is an impermanent material thing that isn't an object of genuine knowledge. Because mortal flesh can't really be known. So true anatomy from Galen through Vesalius is you have to sort of look through the body, that fleshly manifestation, to understand the intelligent design, right? The design that underlies that creation. So you have to not simply look at an object, but look through it, right? Not, in fact, get distracted by the fleshly corpse. So you're sort of looking at it as a window. Vesalius is 1543, Hans Holbein's Ambassadors was 1533, just a few years earlier. Beautiful print that illustrates that great age of scientific exploration, the voyages of exploration, all the navigational tools. And it's a very seductive print in the richness and the beautiful texture of the materials. And so our eyes are naturally drawn to what they're wearing, the beautiful instruments. You can actually read the music there. But as you probably know, this is actually an anamorphic image. That is, it's an image whose true form you can only see when you view it obliquely, and so you have to look at it like this. And when you look at it like this, you can see that, in fact, there's a skull at the very center of the picture. And that's actually the largest thing in the picture. But when you first look at it, chances are you don't notice it. Right? It's by far the largest thing. If you go to Google and you can see Ambassadors, it's by far the largest element in the picture. But your eyes naturally go to the other things which are in focus and are much more beautifully textured. So the lesson is that to truly see, right, and of course this is, again, a lesson about mortality, but the lesson is, in order to truly see the way things are, you have to have somewhat of an oblique gaze. That if you try to focus on things as they are immediately presented to you, then you get distracted by the materiality, the rich beauty, and you forget the fact that these are material things, these are impermanent things, that you are an impermanent being. And so for truly seeing, you have to somehow learn to stand and look askance. There are lots of details that remind us of this. If you look, so here's the skull, you can see it's a very big thing, but when you first look at it, you can easily miss it. This skull is actually, although then replicated, it's a very detailed picture in the hairpin of the man, which also has a little skull. And if you look in the corner here, anybody see what that is? So it's a crucifix. So in this little corner, there's a reminder of death and resurrection, absence and presence. So this is a recurring theme of this period. On the one hand, this lush materiality, this variety of products, and on the other hand, this keen sense of mortality. This is another famous work that sort of illustrates the same principle. This is the Brock triptych. You have John the Baptist, Mary Magdalene, and Christ, of course. So it's a three-panel work, but when you fold it in, you see the back of these, again, is the skull and the crucifix. So this constant reminder, right, of something that's not always visible, but is always there, and that's really what you have to learn to appreciate. So rethinking skeletons. This is a famous illustration from Vesalius. The thing about the skeletons is that they don't look like dead people. They look like living people. They're animated. There's a jaunty looking, somehow, even though it's a skeleton, you somehow associate him like this man around town or something. And of course, the famous dance of death is very lively. And this, I think, is very important. It's interesting to note that you might think of skeletons as something that's, would be naturally of interest to people everywhere, but in East Asia, it's very rare to see depictions of skeletons prior to the 19th century, prior to the Western influence of Western anatomy. It's not something that captured people's attention. But in Western works, particularly from this period on, you get more and more emphasis on skeletons. But they're anatomically correct often, but the emphasis is not on simply just showing the bones, it's showing them in specific postures. So what I want to suggest is that skeletons are not symbols of death, as often spoken of, as they're often referred to, but they're symbols of life. But what I mean by that is I want to distinguish life with a small l and life with a big L. So life with a small l is the opposite of death. There's life and death. But the life that I'm referring to is in between those. So it's that life, it's actually our life, it's my life, it's your life. It's that existence between life and death where you're alive, but you're on the process of heading toward death. This is that keen consciousness that we're alive now, but we're going to die. That sense is what's represented in the animated skeleton. And I'm going to suggest that the emphasis on these first came from a new sense of mortal existence. And that sense of mortal existence, I'm arguing, was closely associated with the distractions created by the modern world. Global trade, it's very similar to this in relative terms to what we see with the internet, where all the internet makes available this huge realm of exploration that we never even suspected. Similarly, that world of global trade, circulation of new goods, new areas, creates this intense curiosity about things, but also the sense that there's only so much that one can absorb in a given lifetime. So that this new sense of mortal existence came from a new world of global distractions. So as you have unlimited objects of curiosity, you have a heightened sense of limited time. And this emphasis on skeletons is an emphasis on mortality, but it's also a mortality conditioned with a sense that you're alive. You can appreciate these things, but you can only appreciate them for a given amount of time. It's a sense of connectedness. So, I've timed it just about right. I'm almost done here. So, we're in Charlottesville, North Carolina, in a given moment, and this is where we are. This nice room, but we can travel. And if we travel to a different part of the world, to really the opposite end of the world, this is just the kind of thing that would be going on in this early modern period. We're traveling to really, really, really far. And we're going to travel to an island which most of you have never been to. I'm sure I've never been there. Because it's a really, 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 really tiny island. It's an island that is 3 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide. And it's the island called the island of Rune. You've heard of the island of Rune. I mean, it's pretty much as far as you can get from Charlottesville, Virginia. But it was once very important. It was important in this period that we're talking about because it was one of the few places in the world where you can get nutmeg. Nutmeg at the time was a very valuable spice. There's only a small handful of places, basically these islands right there and next to it, that you could get nutmeg. So, in 1667, the British and the Dutch conducted trade in which the British trade this island of Run to the Dutch. They essentially concede it. So that's in exchange for another island. Anybody know what island the British get in return for the island of Run? Exactly. So basically they're getting Manhattan in return. So this is just using this as an example to illustrate the connectedness of this world, right? This tiny place that you probably even now is obscure. Very, very difficult to get to, was connected to what is now New York. The final thing that I just want to mention is if you look at these pictures, you see, of course, the skull. And I mentioned the cloths. But you also see a proliferation of shells. This is a great age of shell collection. And shells, of course, often function as money in local economies. They were also sort of one of the more exotic things to come from distant lands. And if you look at cabinets of curiosity, you'll see that they're full of shells. So there's the urn, the skull, and then the shells. Vanitas painting of the period, again, reminding us there are these beautiful gold and silver utensils, but of course this is vain because we're eventually bound to die. There's the skull, there's the clock, reminding us of our mortality. But there's also these shells. So if you start looking, you'll notice that there's shells everywhere. And what's interesting, I think, about the shells is, on the one hand, they remind us of the distances from which these treasures came from. But they're also, I think, interesting because we easily forget. I think this is something probably you can ask yourself if you notice this when you were looking at these. You easily forget that these shells are essentially skeletons. They're the remains of living beings. But these shells, in some sense, epitomize the whole history, that we've sort of forgotten this association with mortality and just simply taken the aesthetic appreciation of these exotic curiosities. So that's my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. We do have a generous amount of time for discussion and conversation, and I know from our experience with the history of medicine class, there is no question that doesn't lead to an interesting answer and set of new perceptions. So please identify yourself when you ask a question.
I'm Karen Knight from the Health Sciences Library. Thank you for that. In the Holbein ambassador's picture, I understand the use of the skull as you mentioned it, but what would the purpose have been in that particular? I mean, I assume he was doing that maybe as a commission for somebody, so why would he have put the skull in that scene?
So this is also the period where the people are also very interested in more generally in perspective. And so perspective on the one hand is used to create so-called realistic depictions, this sense of objectivity. But at the same time, what I want to emphasize is that this is a very special moment in the history of art and science where people have a much more sophisticated, I think, than today, more sophisticated view of reality than we do now, where that sense of reality is, yes, there's a reality out there, there's an object, we want to get close to it, but at the same time, true perception of it is the ability to see that it's deluding us, deceiving us, distracting us by its sheer attractiveness. And that ability to sort of see, look from the side, I think is powerful theme in this period.
Is there a sense also of sort of gaming with the viewer?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I think there's, I mean, if you look at the Vesuvius, I think there's a lot of playfulness in it. This is, a major scientific work, there's no question, but it's important to appreciate how much of that playfulness is inherent in the work.
And it seems like the church at the time wouldn't have approved of that. In my history reading, it seems like the Roman Catholic Church would have been quite threatened by.
That's a good question. I'm not sure. So until this period, basically the discourse of distraction is especially a religious discourse, and distraction is what distracts you away from thought of God. And in this sense, that the emphasis on mortality, I think, still has very strong religious overtones. The sense that we are mortals. Don't forget that. Yeah.
Is it possible for you to tell us a little bit more about the two human figures in that Holbein picture, particularly what they're wearing?
I don't remember all the details, but of course what they're wearing are furs that have traveled a long way. That one is Jean de Danteville, I think. I forget his friend's name, but they're relatively young men in their 20s. Jean de Danteville is one of the leading aristocrats of the period. In the bibliography, you have let's see, these works, the Holbein's Ambassadors, which gives you a very detailed analysis. Yeah.
I wonder, it's not just the church that will have been against distraction, but there is a much longer tendency against curiosity. Kill the cat. I mean, Augustine had a lot to say about probing into secrets.
Yeah.
Do you see that cross-culture? Do you see that elsewhere, for example, in Chinese culture?
Luke's absolutely right, of course, that part of the story is that curiosity and distraction are very closely associated. And the classical discourse on curiosity in the Western tradition, the Logos Classicus, especially St. Augustine, where he's talking about curiosity as the lust of the eyes. So, curiosity is a very strange thing, because normally we like to see beautiful sights, we like to hear beautiful sounds, but in the case of curiosity, we hear that, say, somebody has been murdered on the street and there's gore all over. Then you see this huge crowd that gathers to see what is frightening and, in some sense, repulsive. That's what curiosity is. And so part of the story of the rise of modern science is rehabilitation of curiosity as somehow a good thing. But I think what's interesting about the Vesuvius is that it's at least my reading of it, it's an important turning point in the period where, on the one hand, of course, it's a work that emphasizes manual sort of manipulation and actual observation, but it's also a work where he's emphasizing, when he's pointing not at the corpse, right? He's pointing to the skeleton. And saying, you have to have this very subtle gaze, where you're looking at things, you have to observe things, but always bear in mind that, everything is framed by mortality. And I think eventually that sort of allows for a kind of the transition to curiosity that accommodates this sense of a longer transcendental realm, but it's subsequently forgotten, and then observation just becomes observation of the thing itself.
Hi, my name's Holly. I'm a first-year medical student. I was just wondering, in your discussion of life and death and how skeletons and shells are kind of similar, have you ever given much thought to the fact that while shells represent the remains of a snail, it also represents life in the terms of like hermit crabs and other animals that then use those remains?
I'm sorry, what is the question?
Whereas you had kind of identified the shell as also the remains of an animal.
Yeah.
but it also represents life, and I thought that was kind of similar to how you were discussing that a skeleton doesn't always represent death for humans as well. Maybe not. Never mind.
No, she was using the example of the hermit crab, which adopts the shell of another.
Oh, okay. That's a really interesting one. I never thought about that, but would be interesting to follow up. I don't know if anybody discusses the hermit crab in this kind of context, but it would be interesting.
Hi, I'm Danny Becker. I'm a physician and also from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities. The original sort of balancing act between distraction and attention, what I'm struck with is the way we're paying attention to too many things at one time and multitasking, and we're starting to teach students and residents and faculty to be mindful, to develop sort of a meta-awareness, and it kind of reminds me of when Obi-Wan Kenobi taught Luke Skywalker how to use a lightsaber and to sort of kind of be aware of everything and the Force.
Yes.
So can you blend that into your comments today?
Yes. This will overlap a little bit with what I was saying in the medical school class this morning, but so the word distraction is literally pulling away, and it's the metaphor of tension. But of course, Obi-Wan Kenobi is a chi master, and the logic of distraction, the logic of drawing away is the logic of tension. So it's the imagination of strings. Obi-Wan Kenobi is a master of chi, which means he's a master of fluids. So attention in the East Asian context is the mind is a fluid. The mind can flow out. It can flow into different parts of the body. Right? And if you become good at it, you're mindful. You manage to keep it in the body because it's often flowing out, as you see some attractive site or threatening site is sort of pushed out. And so there. I think one of the interesting things to think about is really the differences between thinking about a body and psychology organized around the logic of the string and tension and relaxation, and the logic of fluids that either flow out or remain inside. And basically this is what Obi-Wan Kenobi is really great at, is sort of managing that. The Force is basically a fluid.
I'm Axel Cooper. I'm a fourth-year med student. My question is, in your sort of exploration of the discourse of distraction and attention, have you given any thought to how societies view substances and how, for example, how caffeine has been viewed over time, and that's a substance that tends to be associated with increased attention versus other substances like alcohol and drugs that may be seen as favoring distraction and sort of attention on things that are not of this sort of world or not functional. Is that something you've given any thought or something you think is pertinent?
I think it's a very interesting point. So if you haven't read this book, Wolfgang Schibelbusch has a really wonderful book called Tastes of Paradise, which is a history of spices, tobacco, tea, and coffee. He makes a very interesting point, which is he emphasizes really what a revolution tea and coffee were in New York, right? Tea and coffee start becoming important in the 17th, and then certainly in the 18th century. And it's hard to appreciate their importance now because previous to that, basically what people in New York drank was alcohol. They drank what would now be considered prodigious amounts of alcohol. Even in the French countryside, I think was Emmanuel research calculated that French peasants were drinking like 2 liters of wine a day. German peasants would drink beer soup, let's not terribly alcoholic, but basically be drinking alcohol all day. So if you think about that, basically people were in a semi-inebriated state all the time. And then you have a drink that wakes you up. This is what tea and coffee is, the advent of a drink that wakes you up. And so his argument is really that there's a close connection between this drink and sort of the new rise of industry.
Lisa, I'm not sure your mic,
Yeah.
his portable mic is on. If you
it
could
doesn't
turn that
Hold
on.
it through the podium, but yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Too close to your right.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, push right.
Hi, my name is Dallas Dugarn. I'm a fourth year at the university. Blaise Pascal in the 15th century would write about, in Penses, he would write about diversions and the problem of diversions and distractions. And his conclusion was not necessarily to be aware of our mortality, but him as a defender of Catholicism, to be aware of our moments and our actions, and as they result for him in eternal salvation, I guess. Do you see any indicators of this in the artwork that you look at in terms of because of the consequences or because of what may happen, this existential crisis, there's therefore more onus on the living than what may come in death, or than the death itself?
So your distinction is basically the sort of Pascal's emphasis on the long-term eternal frame of action. Is that?
Yeah, my emphasis is on the long-term eternity that awaits for Pascal, and what impact that conception of time and existence has on thinkers of this period.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think that tradition of Catholic thought certainly persists, right, and goes on well into the 18th century, I would say. So one of my favorite lines is from Malebranche, who's a follower of Descartes, but also a major religious thinker, where he defines attention as the prayer of the soul. This is what it is to pay attention. It's a form of prayer. Prayer and attention are almost synonymous for him. And this is important for understanding why it is that the Word of God is around everywhere. It's accessible all around us. The preachers are preaching it. It's available. We should be awakened to the truth. But why aren't we? It's because we're not paying attention. If you're not paying attention, then all the words that are said, all the truths that are said, is just noise. This is his expression. So I think there's a lot of parallel between this sort of more strictly religious thought and what I'm describing. I guess what I'm emphasizing here is really that the birth of modern science is at this period is this sort of delicate balance between sort of attention to worldly things, but with a consciousness that these worldly things are just worldly things.
Hi, I'm Monica. I'm a first-year medical student. I was wondering, you briefly mentioned the neuropsychology of how we define what's useful or useless. And I noticed in your presentation you went over several different ages of art. So I wanted to know what you thought, whether the more important force shaping that for us was society kind of imposing as a collective what we should think as useful or uselessness, or individual consciousness deciding, you mentioned like individual values.
First, I was talking about neurophysiology, studies of not useless versus useful, but attention and distraction have been mostly talked about in the context. Neurophysiology is focused on attention and distraction, a psychological phenomenon, and basically what I'm emphasizing is that it's really more existential values of useless and useful. But I think it's very much true that it's a social value. Right? So productivity, if you look at the literature on attentiveness, it's very much an emphasis on productivity and work. So if you're working, you're paying attention. If you're amusing yourself, watching a movie, whatever, surfing the net, this is considered distraction. But as I guess what I'm emphasizing, there's really no intrinsic reason to think that way. It's in that frame of a certain goal, which is, let's say, the work, the context of a society based on certain modes of production, that attention is defined as attention to these work-related things. So I don't know what many of you may think, but for example, novel reading. Is reading a novel distraction or attention? It's certainly, psychologically, can be very intense attention. But again, even individuals may decide, well, sorry. So individuals may decide, well, it's good to read Marcel Proust, but maybe not Tom Clancy. That's distraction. But I think we make these judgments, I think that aspect of the existential aspect of the background of attention and distraction is just my main point. So the other aspect of this, of course, once you start thinking about these things in the mode of this period where things are never quite what they seem, this is actually the nature of our world in general. I want to, Marcia, could you help me here? Sure. And just want to give you one illustration. So everybody know what this is? It looks like a towel, right? So you think, oh yes, this is an orange towel. Yes. If you could then take the end. Oops, sorry. I'm going to go wait. Just put it. Okay. So in Japanese, basically, you go somewhere and you have to bring a gift. Well, this is your gift home to all the people who aren't here. So we're going to roll it up, sort of meet somewhere in the middle, just sort of roll, So now, yes, this is the valuable skill in life, rolling towels. So now we have a rolled towel. So you would say this is a rolled towel. Now we have a folded rolled towel. Who's with little protrusions. Yes. And then basically what you have is Peking duck. It's about lunchtime. You never know what's latent in things.
What a distraction. Anyone have a question or a further comment? Yes, and John, yeah, that one.
Most of how you talked about distraction versus attention seemed like it's really the same psychological activity. You're just focusing on different things. But I know a lot of the discussion about distraction nowadays is about multitasking and kind of splitting attention.
Yeah.
So I was wondering what you had to say about multitasking.
What do I have to say about it? I do it all the time and I worry about it. But I think it's worth thinking about why one worries about it, right? One could worry about it because one's less productive. I think a lot of studies show that multitasking is not a very efficient way to work. But I think ultimately the anxiety, so basically what I'm trying to suggest is that the anxiety about being distracted, whether it's multitasking or doing, is an anxiety about how one should live one's life. That the more possibilities in life, or more possibilities of exploration that you encounter, the more, even if you're not consciously or explicitly aware of this, the more aware you become of how time is limited.
Right behind you, John. I'm not.
Thank you, it's fascinating. I just wonder whether it is possible to think about, I'm actually, like you talk about distraction, I'm kind of focused on the whole idea of attention, and that I thought was really amazing that Renaissance was a period when a great deal of magnification and visualization of things took place, and I was thinking about perspective, and thinking about the magnifying glasses and the telescopes and so on. It's all about paying attention to a very tiny, small, distant objects, and so you're kind of presenting the other side of the coin, if you like. It's very interesting. Are you thinking through like the difference between a visual attention and intellectual attention? I'm just wondering whether it makes sense to make a distinction.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought specifically about intellectual attention. The discourse, as with many aspects of the philosophy of the period, tends to be a conflation of the visual and the intellectual, and sort of seeing and knowing. But your point about detail, I think, is absolutely right. So what I'm suggesting is that that intense observational fine detail is, I think this is a great picture because it sort of illustrates perfectly, right, how, if you look at close-ups of this picture, you can actually read the script of the musical score, right? You can see that, in fact, the string a lute has a broken string. It's that finely drawn, right? So that kind of detail is accompanied by the reminder, right, that all of these are distractions, that the more precise, the more beautiful thing, then the more distracting they are. And I think that's also the lesson of anatomy in this period. Let me see if I have, let me just show you this last slide. This is illustration of a Buddhist illustration. I don't know if you can see this, but so this is a woman has. Should I start again? So this is a Buddhist illustration of 9 phases of death. And it's an example of why it is that there's not such an interest in skeletons in East Asia. So this is the 9 phases of death. A woman has died at the beginning, and then basically her body starts to decompose. And so eventually you will see bones. So arguably there is a skeleton there, but thank you. But the point is that there's no special significance because it's one process, one part of a long continuum of disintegration to nothingness. Right? So it isn't the skeleton as the opposition between life and death as sort of 2 poles, but it's this long continuous process from being into nothingness.
That's really interesting. Do you see this as probably an acceptable and possible way to present skeletons in East Asian cultures? And I would agree with you that it's difficult to find skeletons, but then to present in this way, perhaps.
It is. I'll just show you briefly. The one notable exception in the early period is this very famous painting by Yusung, which is called the Fantasy Show. I don't know if we can show it. Let's just conclude with this. It's an odd picture. There's been lots of studies of it. There's no textual evidence to really give you a clear interpretation of it, but it's a skeleton dressed as a merchant, sort of tantalizing, playing with a marionette skeleton and tantalizing a child. We know that this is a merchant because he's wearing this cap of a merchant and has wares. And basically, the idea is that somehow he's manipulating this skeleton and attracting the child, and somehow the woman looking over, taking care of the child is alarmed, and that's all we know. But it's a very interesting picture, but it's the one exception of representation of skeleton in traditional East Asia.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're at the end of our hour, but thank you for a wonderful and provocative presentation, and all of you for interesting follow-up conversation. I invite you to come next week. Next week will be our last Medical Center Hour program called The Place, The Thing, using theater to teach, teaching leadership with the creative arts. We have Ed Freeman from the Darden School, who actually uses theater and improvisational drama in his teaching. And he'll be here to talk about that, and there may be some connections possibly with medical education as well. So we'll look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, please thank Shigehisa Kuriyama for a wonderful Crispell lecture, and thank you to the History of the Health Sciences lecture series and Joan Klein for partnering with us throughout the year on our history series. Thanks so much.